In Unit 2, we will spend time with the historical books of the Bible. They are a fairly large chunk of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. Even though we may not all be enthusiastic about historical material, but apparently God is. And so He's left a lot of books dealing with history. Now, when we're talking about historical books, basically we're looking at that listing of books between Torah and the Psalms, or more specifically Job. And those books cover a very wide period of time. Begins with the chronology. It tells us about the period of the judges, the period of monarchy, and how the kingdom came to an end. So basically, we could say that it stretches from around 1450 BC to about 586 BC, when the kingdom of Judah was finally destroyed. And along the way, you have 300 years of history relating to the judges. Then you have about 120 years of what is called a united monarchy. And then you have roughly 350 years of divided monarchy. And of course, there's a little bit of period before the judges, the conquest of the nation, and so on. And a little bit of after the destruction of Jerusalem, what is called the post-exile period. So the history books cover a big chunk of the timeline of the Bible. Everything from Joshua to basically Malachi. And then if you add some other materials that are historical in nature that you have in the prophets and so on, you discover that God pays so much time to history. Makes you wonder why. Well, perhaps because God's activities are limited to time and space. And history is how we record events of time and space, whether it's a personal story about my life, or about the family, or about the whole nation. The end result is the same. Now, since these books occupy such a big chunk of the Old Testament, it is important for us to at least have a look at them, try to understand what is happening and why history might be important to the Bible and to God, and perhaps to you and to me. The first major chunk of these historical books involves two books, Joshua and Judges. These two books basically cover about 350 years of history, and they cover two specific events. One is the conquest. Now that they're out of Egypt, out of the desert, and they have finally entered the land through the leadership, or with the leadership of Joshua, they found that the land was occupied by a lot of people. Yet this is the land God had promised them. And so they had to go about conquering the land. The book contains a lot of stories about how Joshua and his people would take the land piece by piece by piece and then allocate it to the different tribes. The book of Judges identifies these various judges. These were warriors sent by God to fight against the enemies. It was still a period of settlement. The Judges period lasted about 300 years, so it's a fairly lengthy period. It's a period of much confusion and anarchy, not a very safe period for life history. It's sometimes called the Dark Ages of Israel. What is important about these two books are two ideas. The first idea is that Israel basically failed its mission, even Joshua. God said, take the whole land. They did not. They could not take some places or some cities. They were deceived into making an unnecessary treaty with some other groups. And when Joshua died, a lot of the land was still not yet taken by the Israelites. In the story of the Judges, we discover why Israel failed. Israel, their relationship with God was very much dependent on the leader. So if the leader was strong, had a good relationship with God, the people followed him. If the leader was weak and did not have a good relationship with God, the people followed him. Much of the spiritual and moral and political failure of Israel during these 300 years of the Judges period is attributed to this simple fact. They did not have the faith, the loyalty to follow God exactly as he wanted. They often yielded to the temptation of doing whatever they wanted, and then when they get in trouble, ask God for help, and then he would put their lives back up. And they kept going like this, and God would straighten them, and they'd fall again, and God would straighten them. And it's hard to imagine a history that keeps repeating itself that way, but Israel did. We can learn something from that history. It's better to be consistent in our relationships with other people, but especially with God. The next three sets of books have Volume 1 and Volume 2 in the English Bible. But in the original writings, they were just one book. So even though in the English Bible we have 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, for instance, it is actually just the book of Samuel or the scroll of Samuel. Now in the Samuel scroll, we have the story of this miracle child called Samuel, who became one of the special leaders of Israel. Not much attention is actually paid to him by Bible students. His story is not as long and as fanciful as that of Moses, but he occupied the same position with the same responsibilities that Moses actually had. He was like a second Moses to the nation of Israel. He also stood in that transition point, just like Moses, between the dark ages of Judges and the equally not so pleasant period of the kings that is coming afterwards. As a family man, he was a bit dysfunctional. His children were not very trustworthy. Even the people couldn't trust them. There were unfortunate choices that the children did, but the books concentrate on his relationship with the first two kings of Israel. He had a very tense relationship with the first king, Saul, who often disobeyed, and most of the books are about the Samuel-Saul relationship. And then a little bit in 2 Samuel and so on, you have the relationship with David. Now that was a much more peaceful relationship because David was more God-fearing, and so he respected the prophets of God. What we learn about this early part of the monarchy, after Judges and then monarchy, is that the kings that were chosen, and Samuel chose two of them, were different. Saul looked impressive physically, but mentally and spiritually he was weak. David was just a normal-looking young teenager when he was chosen, but his spiritual and moral relationships with God were extremely strong, and so very different outcomes. Saul did not really succeed. Both Saul and David ruled for 40 years each, but Saul was not very successful. David would be considered the greatest king, extremely successful. And all because of a special relationship, not just to God, but to the servant of God, Samuel. It's important to measure our relationship not just with God, but with the people who also represent God in our world. First and Second Kings in the English Bible, again, was one scroll in the Hebrew Bible. So the book of the kings, the record of the kings. And this is a historical document. It doesn't really evaluate the kings. It simply recounts what they did. It starts with the first king, Saul, and it goes through the whole monarchy period and then the divided monarchy right to the very end. And in these books, we learn about every single king of Israel, not only through the united period, but even in the divided period. Every single one is listed, and some information about their political achievements as king. Not much is said about their character or their relationship with God, minimal commentary. Kings do not really commentate, and it presents itself, this scroll presents itself as simply a historical record, rather objective. Tells us who was the first king, the second king, and on and on and on, when dynasty changed, kings that were assassinated, kings that were overthrown, kings that died young, kings that ruled for a long time, kings that ruled for a short time. It gives us time periods, it dates things, very historical document. Of all the books that we meet in these historical collections, the Scroll of the Kings is the most historically accurate books, because they were written like we would write modern history, facts and figures, dates and names and places, very objective. And so this is an important set. It traces both nations even after the division, Israel and then Judah. It was not leaning towards one or the other. We will see the difference in the next set or the next scroll that we look at. And because of this, Kings is an important collection in us understanding the timeline of the Bible. If we did not have the Kings, we really would not know how long David ruled, Solomon ruled, and when did the kingdom divide, and why did the kingdom divide. The only thing the books contribute from an assessment point of view is to give us the reasons why the kingdom got split. The heavy hand of Solomon's reign, too much taxes, too many young men conscripted into the army, too much labor, too much energy put in the building works of Solomon, and then the stubbornness of his son Rehoboam, who refused to listen to the people, and that caused a split in the kingdom. And so we see a little bit of what we would call today a political revolution in the book. It's an old idea. It was present even in Israel. As Solomon would say in one of his writings, nothing really ever changes. There is nothing new under the sun. And Kings demonstrates that history always sort of repeats itself. The scroll that we consider 1st and 2nd Chronicles, again, it's one scroll in the Hebrew Bible. This records primarily the history of Judah. It starts with David and Solomon, but once the kingdom split, it didn't pay too much attention to one half of the kingdom. It concentrated on the half that remained in David's house. You see, when Israel split, they named themselves Israel, that was in the northern part, and Judah in the southern part. Judah is the remnant from David's empire. And that's the one that lasted longer, that went into exile much later, and that occupied Jerusalem, most importantly. So they had command of the main city and the only temple that was available. Chronicles has a spiritual agenda. It's not so interested in the historical achievements of the kings of Judah. It is much more interested in the spiritual achievements and failures of the kings of Judah. And so it assesses them. This king was faithful to God. This king was unfaithful to God. This king was godly. This king was ungodly. And what they do, what this scroll does, these two books do, is to give us stories and insights into the lives of these kings that we do not have from the very historical history record of kings. And this is important, at least with the kingdom of Judah. It gives us a deeper insight into why the failure happened and how far away from the covenant the people moved and what sort of relationship they had with God. And yet we can see even better the faithfulness of God and his people despite all of this failure. And so we get to see this contrast. We get to learn what it means to be faithful to God at the political level, what it means to be unfaithful to God at the political level. But the books simply re-emphasizes the lesson that we already discover in Kings and Judges. And that is, as the leader, in this case the king, goes, so goes the nation. And when we look at modern history, we see exactly the same thing. The kind of leader you have in government, whether it's a prime minister or president, produces a certain kind of nation. And most people in life tend to be followers. And so Chronicles is an important scroll because it helps us to understand why people may fail God. Perhaps because they have a weak model of leadership, spiritually weak model of leadership to follow. And because of that, they can't always stand on their feet, since people don't really make up their own minds about what to believe. They simply follow what a leader says they should believe. And spiritually, that can be a disaster. Tucked among all these history books is a little novel, if you like, a short novel or novella called Ruth. Tells the history of one family, and it shows that a single family's history is as important to God as a national history. Here's a family that migrated to a foreign land because of famine and all kinds of tragedies happened. They had to, part of the family that survived that foreign land of Moab returns to Israel, discovers a redeemer to help them out, and becomes a lesson for the redeemer who would come later, and that is Jesus. The little story of Ruth teaches us some important lessons about redemption. That the redeemer, in this case the man called Boaz, must have the heart for redemption. He must be able to redeem, and he should be willing and have the resources to do that. This became a sort of preview of Jesus coming as our Redeemer. He had the heart and the willingness for God's people. He had the resources as the Creator, and most importantly, he is kind of related to them. Boaz is a Redeemer who is also a relative. There's a blood bonding. And so the story illustrates how God works, even at a very individual level. Sometimes we think of God as directing the whole universe and directing the whole world, that does he really have time for me and for my family? And Ruth says, yes, God directs the lives of one family as well. And in this book, we discover how somebody from a foreign country can become a part of the covenant of God and experience this redemption that was brought. And so a little piece of history that is added to all the historical books as well. I hope you enjoy reading Ruth. Also included in these historical books is another novella named after a woman, the main character in the story. Ruth is set in the period of Judges. Esther is set in the period after the exile, when there was no more Israel or Judah as a nation. She, in fact, lived in Persia and eventually became, even though she was a Jewish orphan girl, she became the queen of Persia, and then performed a great act of bravery to save her people, the Jewish people who lived in Persia, from an apparent genocide attempt by a man called Haman. Now, her personal story is not as important as the lesson. This is a mysterious book because the word God doesn't even appear in this book. And the people involved, there's the king, the Persian king. There is this bad guy called Haman, and there is Esther's cousin, Mordecai, who basically brought her up, and he is the good guy. So there's a little bit of a personal war at the political level between these two men, Haman and Mordecai, and then Esther comes in between, and when Mordecai wants to destroy all of the Jews, Esther comes to their aid and enables them to escape that attempted genocide. The book is very intriguing because it gives us some lessons about what it means to stand for the right. You know, we live in a time and world where people will stand for the right only if it affects them personally. Esther was the queen, so probably nothing would have happened, nothing bad would have happened or could have happened to her. But she decided that the fate of her people is important. And so standing up for that right at her own risk became a dominant part of the book. Another lesson from the book is the courage to do what is right. Many people believe this is wrong. We should do this, but don't have the courage to do it. to use a contemporary example, we know that plastic is having a bad impact on the environment, on global warming, climate change, and all of those things. But where's the courage to say, I will not use plastic? And this is the difficulty. We have also learned that animal farming is producing nearly a third of the carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases, including methane, that have changed the climate of the world. But where's the courage to say, okay, I will stop eating meat so that I can help bring down greenhouse gases? And you will say, well, it's just me, one alone. But if every person makes that decision, imagine the change in the world. Esther saved a whole nation of people by that courage. Would you be willing to do the same thing? There are two history books that are separated in the English Bible, called Ezra and Nehemiah. But in the Hebrew Bible, they are treated as one scroll. It's really more like Volume 1 and Volume 2. These two books deal with the rebuilding period. Okay, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, took the people away to Babylon, what is called the captivity of the exile, and they were there for approximately 100 years before the Persians permitted them to return. They did. And the two dominant characters in the stories is, of course, Ezra, who was a scribe, and Nehemiah, who was a government official in Persia. There were some other people that are named here, like Zerubbabel was appointed governor of this new Jewish nation restarting. And there was Haggai, the prophet, Zechariah, the prophet. There was Joshua, the high priest. So there were a few significant people who were responsible for that migration back. See, the exile took them away from the land, but in Ezra and Nehemiah, we read of the migration back. Ezra is also important because he's the first guy who began collecting all the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament books together. But maybe the most important thing about Ezra and Nehemiah is what we can learn about making choices. Nehemiah in particular gave up a very high ranking, and I would assume a high power and a high profile job in the government to come and help the people in Jerusalem to rebuild the nation, rebuild the city, rebuild the temple. Now these men were extremely successful. They rebuilt the country, they rebuilt the city, they rebuilt the temple, they did all the things in a very short span of time. In fact, the walls of the cities under Nehemiah were rebuilt in just 53 days. The temple was not as big as Solomon's temple, but it was rebuilt fairly quickly. We have a group of leaders who had a profound impact on the Jewish people returning back to Jerusalem. And this is important again, the same lesson in all the history books. If the leaders are close to God, if the leaders do what God wants them to do, then God grants them the kind of success that they need. And so we see that happening in all of these history books. Walk away from God and life is a failure. Stay close to God and life will succeed.